evening. The tiny Persian Gulf kingdom of Kuwait is in the hands of Iraqi invaders tonight.
Saddam Hussein has taken the world by surprise.
A line has been drawn in the sand.
Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait set in motion the largest UN troop deployment in a generation. There was going to be a war, and television was ready.
Boston Globe. Here.
It should have been the greatest coverage of a war since the news camera was invented. But when reporters and camera crews arrived in Saudi Arabia, they discovered that the Pentagon was not allowing independent reporting. Instead, military public affairs officers would shepherd journalists on guided tours of coalition troops preparing for battle. These groups of reporters and camera crews, called media pools, were strictly controlled. The military decided where they could go and who they could interview. Worried by the use of media pools, the major U.S. news organizations held a series of meetings at the Pentagon. They submitted plans they hoped would guarantee free and independent reporting. The Defense Department listened politely.
I think the news organizations made their position very clear. This is what they wanted. A plan was drawn up based on that. The military command, General Schwarzkopf and his commanders in Saudi Arabia, basically rejected that and said they felt that that would jeopardize the mission.
But military documents released after the war, including one called Annex F, indicate that even before the meetings with network executives, the Bush administration had decided to make media pools the sole means of combat coverage.
I think the administration decided to keep the coverage as sanitized as possible. The biggest fear was that there might be some early casualties, which would be seen on American television.
Okay, if you just follow me then. Thanks.
The battle for independent press coverage was over before the war began. All the major news organizations reluctantly submitted to the media pools.
I have to say, at rock bottom, the people responsible for allowing that travesty to occur were the executives and managements and ownerships of the big American television networks, who did not do enough to object to what was going on.
But not all reporters would be confined to media pools. Some went to Iraq, where they would cover the war in a way that had never been done before, live from the enemy's capital city. Reporters like CNN's Peter Arnett had to deal with Iraqi censorship, but they were beyond the reach of the U.S. military.
When the government of George Bush realized there'd be media there, then became the full court press to try and talk the American media out of Baghdad.
I think they were genuinely pissed off that we were there and had not responded to their repeated warnings. I had received a call from President Bush, and I had spoken with General Powell. It was clear, based on those calls, that they wanted us out.
Something is happening outside.
When the attack on Baghdad came, only CNN was able to report the news live to the world, with voice reports down a telephone line.
Anti-aircraft gunfire going into the sky.
Pictures of the first night's attack would not be seen for another 24 hours. But CNN's voice reports had scooped the Pentagon's official announcement by 27 minutes. In Saudi Arabia, Gary Matsumoto was a reporter assigned to the Quick Reaction Pool, an elite group of journalists who had been promised that they would be taken to the front lines to cover the fighting. After weeks of preparation and training, days before the fighting began, the orders finally came. Under cover of darkness and in strict military secrecy, Quick Reaction Pool number 5 was taken on its first mission to cover U.S. frontline troops.
Must have been maybe an hour or so, hour and a half. The sun starts to rise on the horizon. We land. Cloud of dust. We're clambering off. The dust settles, and we see where they brought us to cover the news. The largest bakery and laundry facility in Saudi Arabia. We were speaking to soldiers who said, hey, take a look at this. We bake 800 loaves of bread here every day, and try this. It's fantastic.
They've just been probing so far, skirmishes.
Bob Simon of CBS News had broken away from military media pools. During the early days of Desert Storm, his reporting was strikingly different than the military's version of events. He showed that Iraq had attacked a town in Saudi Arabia.
Heading in the other direction, south towards safety, the people of Khafji.
He suggested that U.S. troops in the area were on their own because Saudi forces had abandoned their positions. At the time, the Pentagon had been praising the fighting spirit of the Saudi troops and had made no mention of any ground attacks.
Basically, I think what it showed was that it showed warfare. And the Pentagon media strategy was to show a very sanitized, clean, painless version of warfare. A very pretty picture, but without any relationship to what goes on during a war.
Are you talking about the Mr. Simon and his party?
Bob Simon paid a price for his independent reporting. Captured shortly after his story was broadcast, he spent 40 days in an Iraqi prison. In Baghdad, Peter Arnett's reporting would also prove costly. As the war progressed, Arnett's reports showed the destruction of strategic targets inside Iraq.
Keep your eye on all sides of the building as the airplane overflies the building and drops the bomb down through the center of the building.
According to military briefers, only surgical strikes on military targets were being conducted.
And you'll be able to count each bomb. 1, 2.
Yesterday, Information Ministry officials took me on a 2-hour visit to a powdered milk factory. They said it was destroyed by American bombing.
Peter Arnett contradicted the U.S. military by reporting that cruise missiles had destroyed a powdered milk factory, not a chemical weapons plant. The Bush administration was furious.
The reaction was swift and very, very nasty. In fact, the White House deplored my report on the baby milk plant, saying clearly labeling it propaganda from Saddam Hussein.
Mr. Speaker, CNN's coverage of Peter Arnett being used as a propaganda tool by Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein is disgusting, if not treasonous.
For the Canadian media, covering the war meant sitting far from the action, waiting for the day's censored videotape to be delivered to their hotels.
No, that's not fair. Not really. Yeah.
Only the American press was allowed into U.S. military media pools.
I mean, Canada was the 4th largest contributor from the West to the international force. They've been the first to go in on the side of the Americans and put over 3,000 men and women's life technically at risk in the Gulf area. When it came to the liberation of Kuwait, Canada was allotted 1 seat on a yellow school bus with all the other international reporters to go in. 1 reporter went in, it was me, and I only got there by flipping a coin with 2 other Canadian reporters to see which one of us would be allowed to see the liberation of Kuwait.
The air raid sirens are just now going off here near these U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia.
In the early days of Desert Storm, the war came right to the reporters.
Okay, let's go. We're firing Patriots. We've got flares and we've got sirens.
It was dramatic television, but there were no reporters stationed with the Patriot missile crews. The press relied on the Pentagon to tell them how many Iraqi Scud missiles had been intercepted.
8 of the 9 were intercepted by Patriot missiles.
Only after the war did reporters learn that the Pentagon had been exaggerating the success rate.
Reporters were not able to tell whether Patriot missiles were effective against Scud missiles. Those were matters that we were informed of, told about by military briefers. And it appears in retrospect that those briefers were, shall we say, dissembling. They were not telling the whole truth.
Almost all pictures of the Gulf War came from the military-controlled media pools.
You are seeing a TV picture.
Or as video clips provided by the Pentagon to an anxious press, with hours of live coverage to fill.
By God, we've kicked Vietnam syndrome once and for all. Thank you very, very much.
This was the war the Pentagon wanted the world to see, and it was delivered to the public by television news. The power of governments to influence what we see was one of the biggest pressures shaping television in the 90s.